When the siren stopped in front of the wooden house, the girl didn't cry. She stood motionless on the porch, barefoot, holding a phone that was too big for her hands. The blue light flashed in her face, as if apologizing. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by a deep cough, followed by the sound of a chair being dragged. A paramedic asked where her mother was. The girl pointed to the empty street and said softly that she had gone out to dance and would be back later. Later when? Nobody knew. The old man, huddled on the sofa, tried to breathe silently, as if asking for help was a mistake. The elderly woman in the bedroom called her husband by a name no one there knew, and the girl repeated, "I did what I could." If you follow true stories like this one, subscribe now so it can reach more people. Now let me tell you how it all began. Months before that siren, the couple lived slowly, the way old age allows. They leaned against the walls, divided their medicines into small boxes, and wrote down bills in a notebook, stained with coffee. Their daughter had returned to help, she said, bringing suitcases, a hurried smile, and promises that, in the United States, those who work manage. But she worked little and disappeared often. When Friday arrived, her perfume filled the house and the car's music vibrated like an invitation. She kissed the girl's forehead and left the key on the table as if leaving behind a chore. He had been a mechanic his whole life. His hands still smelled of oil, even after so many baths. She sewed for neighbors, keeping scraps as if they were keepsakes. They no longer drove. They no longer climbed stairs endlessly. Their daughter, however, didn't accept their slowness as part of life. She treated it as an obstacle. She said the rent was expensive, that she needed time, and that the 8-year-old girl was responsible. She said this loudly in front of her parents, as if it were a compliment. The child learned to heat canned soup and separate pills by color. When she made a mistake, her mother didn't yell. She just rolled her eyes and slammed the door. And the door was the beginning of fear, because I never knew when someone would come back. At first, the daughter would say it was just one night. I would return on Saturday afternoon with glitter in my hair and a laugh that didn't match the house. Then she started disappearing for 2 days, sometimes 3. The couple would ask, and she would answer with confusing stories, shifts, friends, opportunities. No one dared confront her because they depended on her for everything: groceries, appointments, medicine, even opening letters. When the refrigerator was empty, the girl improvised. She would take the leftover bread from breakfast, hide a few slices in the cupboard, and fill glasses with water to trick her stomach. She taught her grandparents to chew slowly, as if it were a game. And, in the early morning, I would hear their stomachs rumble like a trapped animal and feel guilty for not having more. Over time, it wasn't just food that was lacking. Letters from the bank began arriving with red stamps and words the couple didn't understand. Their daughter would grab everything beforehand, tear it up, and say it was advertising. He kept his father's card in her wallet, saying it was for security. When someone called asking about a late payment, she would change her voice, pretend to be her mother, and hang up quickly. The girl saw small things disappear: coins from the jar, her grandfather's wedding ring one afternoon, a simple ring her grandmother had worn since she was young. When asked, the daughter said they had lost them in the mess. One night, the child found an empty envelope in the trash with her grandfather's name printed on it. She couldn't read everything. The school would call, asking why the girl was absent so often. She would say she was sick, but her voice betrayed exhaustion. In reality, she stayed home because her grandparents couldn't be alone, and because she was afraid that in her absence, the house would be overrun with promises and demands. Her grandmother would forget pots on the stove and then cry, confused. Her grandfather would trip on the rug and laugh to hide his embarrassment. The daughter postponed appointments, saying doctors were expensive and that they exaggerated. When the health center sent a message, she would reply that it's already been resolved. And so the couple grew smaller. Fewer visits, less conversation, less of the world. The girl, at 8 years old, became a clock, a nurse, and a doorman without anyone noticing. In the week of the incident, the cold arrived early, and the house felt thin, as if the wind were passing through the walls. The daughter left on Thursday, saying she would be back just a minute. She took the car, her purse, even her father's warm coat. She left a package of stale bread on the table and no lights on. On the second night, the power went out in the neighborhood, and the girl lit candles in a cupboard. The grandfather began to breathe with difficulty and asked for water in a distant voice. The grandmother, sitting on the bed, kept repeating that she needed to talk to her daughter. The child looked for the emergency number on a crumpled piece of paper and dialed, trembling. When the call was answered, she didn't say, "Help," she said, "Please." On the other end, someone listened silently. They entered with flashlights. The house smelled of medicine and damp cloth. A paramedic asked what there was to eat. The girl opened the cupboard and showed the package of bread, already stale, and the water pitcher. No one said anything for a moment. The grandfather tried to get up, but his legs gave way. He apologized as if it were his fault. The grandmother called for her daughter, insisting that she should be arriving soon. They asked where the mother was, and the girl replied that she didn't know. She only knew how to wait. Outside, a neighbor murmured that this happened always. When the ambulance closed the door, the child saw something on the living room floor that hadn't been there before. And that's when everything really began. The object on the living room floor was a crumpled envelope, fallen from the daughter's bag, forgotten in the rush. The girl picked it up without understanding why it seemed important. Inside, there were folded papers, large letters, words she didn't know, but she recognized her grandfather's name printed more than once. One of the paramedics asked to see it. He read it silently, took a deep breath, and called another colleague. The girl watched the faces change, as if something was finally being seen. The ambulance left with the couple, and the child remained sitting on the stairs, hugging the envelope, waiting for someone to explain what no one ever explained. At the hospital, the grandparents were separated on different stretchers. The grandmother asked about her husband every 5 minutes, forgetting the answer soon after. The grandfather closed his eyes and murmured that everything was fine, that there was no need to bother. A young doctor asked who the legal guardian was. The girl reflexively raised her hand, then lowered it, embarrassed. They said the mother needed to be called. They tried the phone, voicemail. They tried again. Nothing. A social worker approached the child, knelt down to be at her level, and asked how long this had been going on. The girl didn't know how to answer. She only said that it was like that. While the tests were being done, someone finally opened the envelope. Inside were late payment notices, cut-off notices, a simple statement showing frequent cash withdrawals. The grandfather's name appeared, but the signature didn't match. There was also a simple power of attorney, signed with a trembling hand, authorizing the daughter to handle matters. The older doctor shook his head. It wasn't an isolated case. The social worker noted approximate dates, asked about food, medicine, school. The girl answered with short phrases, as if she didn't want to bother anyone. When asked what they ate when her mother went out, she said bread. When asked for how long, she said, until she gets back. The grandfather was diagnosed with dehydration and the onset of pneumonia. The grandmother had worsening confusion and signs of malnutrition. None of this had appeared suddenly. It was a series of layers of neglect. The doctor explained that they would need to be hospitalized. The girl asked if she could stay too. They said no, that someone would take care of her. She felt fear for the first time, without knowing what to do. In the hallway, she heard a nurse comment that, "This happens every day." That didn't comfort her. The police were called not as an immediate punishment, but as a matter of protocol. An officer spoke with the social worker, then with the girl. He asked if the mother hit her. She said no, that the mother didn't stay. He asked if she yelled sometimes. He asked if she left food sometimes. He asked if she left her alone for days. The girl nodded. The officer took notes, seriously. They said they would try to locate the mother. When they succeeded, it was already dawn. She answered, irritated, as if they had interrupted something important. She said the parents were exaggerating, that the girl was clever, that it was persecution. She promised to show up when she could. The child spent the night in a waiting room, wrapped in a thin blanket. She thought about her separated grandparents and the empty house. She wondered if she had done something wrong by calling. In the morning, the social worker returned with a snack. It was simple but warm. The girl ate slowly, ashamed of being hungry. They said she would stay temporarily with a foster family until the situation was clarified. She asked if she could see her grandparents. They took her to the bedroom door. Her grandmother smiled when she saw her and said she was proud. Her grandfather squeezed her hand weakly and apologized for everything. She didn't understand why. The mother appeared at the end of the day, wearing sunglasses and looking impatient. She spoke loudly in the hallway, complaining about the exaggeration, saying she worked too much and that no one helped. When she saw her daughter, she tried to smile, but the smile wouldn't come. The social worker calmly explained what was being investigated: abandonment, neglect, possible financial abuse. The mother laughed nervously, saying that was something only people who don't understand life would say. She asked to take the girl. They said no. For the first time, someone said no to her. In the following days, the investigation progressed without fanfare. Neighbors confirmed long absences. The school handed over attendance records. The bank confirmed suspicious transactions. There were no stereotypical villains, only repeated choices. The daughter tried to justify everything as a necessity, as a right. She said her parents were a burden, that her life also mattered. No one disputed that. They disputed the outcome. The couple, now fed and medicated, began to improve slowly. The grandmother would ask about her daughter and then forget. The grandfather cried all night, not because of the illness, but because of the shame of not having protected his granddaughter. The girl began to fall asleep without hearing doors slamming. She missed her grandparents, but also felt relieved not to have to watch the clock. She learned that adults also make mistakes, and that asking for help is not betrayal. One day, the social worker showed her the envelope and carefully explained that it had helped protect them. The girl nodded without smiling. For her, none of this was a victory. It was simply the end of a burden that should never have been hers. When the couple was discharged from the hospital, they didn't return to the same house. They went to a simple place with routine visits and regular meals. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. The mother faced administrative and legal consequences without drama, without headlines. Life went on with discreet scars. Sometimes the girl remembered the cold nights and the bread and water. Other times she remembered the siren and the blue light. And she understood, little by little, that the terrible thing wasn't what happened that night, but how long it took for someone to truly notice. After the hospital discharge, the days took on an order the couple didn't remember having. There were schedules, different voices, full plates. The grandfather found it strange that he didn't need to ask for water. The grandmother asked where her granddaughter was, and when she appeared during visits, she held her hand, as if it were the only firm thing in the world. The girl came accompanied, sat nearby, told little stories about her new school without mentioning the silence of her old home. Nobody spoke of their daughter. Her name seemed too heavy to fit in the room. Gradually, the routine revealed the extent of the neglect. A nurse noticed old marks on the grandfather's arms. not from direct violence, but from repeated falls without medical attention. A doctor noted that the weight loss was not recent. The social worker gathered documents that had been ignored for months. It was a neglect that didn't scream, but corroded. The couple had been left to slowly disappear, without scandal, without witnesses, and the child placed as a buffer, as if her presence absolved everything. The investigation wasn't progressing quickly, and that seemed unfair to those who had suffered, but that's how it was. Paperwork, interviews, confirmations. The daughter kept calling, alternating between crying and anger. She said she was being punished for being a single mother, that no one understood the effort. In one call, she blamed her own child, saying she was exaggerating, that she had always been dramatic. The social worker ended the conversation and took note. There was no remorse there, only fear of losing control. Grandpa asked to speak, not with his daughter, but with someone who could listen without interrupting. He explained that he had signed the power of attorney on a day when he was confused after a fall. He said he trusted her because he always believed that family doesn't abandon them. She said she felt ashamed for not having realized sooner what her granddaughter was carrying. The grandmother on another day said something simple. "I thought this was just getting old." No one corrected her immediately. It was necessary to respect her time to understand. The girl, in turn, was trying to adapt to being a child. The foster family didn't demand that she cook or prepare her medication. They asked her how school was, what she liked to draw. At night, she would wake up startled, thinking she had forgotten something on the stove. It took her a few seconds to remember that there was no stove to watch. She cried silently, afraid of bothering anyone. She learned that hunger also leaves marks that don't show. In a simple hearing, without an audience, it was decided that the daughter could not resume custody. There were no shouts, just the reading of facts. The daughter tried to argue that everything had been exaggerated by interfering people. The judge asked her to explain the absences, the bank statements, the feeding schedule. The answers were vague. When asked why the child was left alone for days, she said she needed to live. The word hung in the air, heavy. Live for whom? The couple was moved to a discreet assisted living facility with small rooms and windows overlooking a simple garden. Grandma liked the flowers. Grandpa liked the fearless silence. They began receiving regular visits, medical care, and someone to explain each bill before payment. The girls started visiting them on Sundays. She brought drawings, talked about friends. Grandpa always apologized, and she always said everything was all right, even without being sure what that meant. The daughter lost access to finances, lost the authority she never exercised as a caregiver. He tried to reverse decisions, but each attempt revealed more contradictions. There was no spectacular arrest, nor exemplary punishment. There were limits, and for someone accustomed to crossing boundaries without consequences, that was the hardest part. She began to say that she had been abandoned by the system. She didn't realize that it was others who had been abandoned. Over time, Grandma began to remember less of the recent past and more of the distant past. She spoke of her childhood, of an old radio, of a recipe she never made again. Grandpa wrote small lists, as if organizing was a silent apology. One afternoon, he told the social worker that he no longer wanted to see his daughter, not out of hatred, but out of exhaustion. "I've waited too long," he said. This was recorded as a legitimate wish. The girl, in therapy, drew a house with a table full of food. When asked who was there, she drew her grandparents and herself. Her mother didn't appear on the drawing. The therapist didn't ask why. You know that some absences need to stay that way for a while. The child began to eat slowly, to sleep without startles. She still kept bread in her pocket sometimes out of habit. When she realized this, she laughed at herself. It was the beginning of unlearning. Nothing in that story was unusual. The abandonment didn't manifest itself with explicit violence, but with repeated choices. It wasn't a single tragedy, but a sequence of omissions. What happened that night didn't fall from the sky. It was built little by little, in the certainty that no one was watching. What changed wasn't luck. It was the gaze. Someone watched. Someone believed. Someone said enough. Months later, the girl walked slowly through the garden with her grandmother. Her grandfather watched from the bench, a glass of water in his hand. The sun was low. The grandmother said her granddaughter had been brave. The girl replied that she was just scared. Grandma smiled and said that sometimes it's the same thing. The world didn't fix itself that day, but for the first time in a long time, no one there was hungry. Time doesn't erase things, but it changes their weight. In their new place, the couple began to recognize small signs of dignity that had disappeared without them noticing. Clean silverware carefully placed, someone knocking on the door before entering, questions asked patiently. The grandfather began to walk short distances every morning, always counting his steps in a low voice. The grandmother liked to fold clothes, even when it wasn't necessary, as if organizing were a way of keeping the world in its place. They still missed their granddaughter on the days she didn't come, but they no longer felt afraid when night fell. The girl remained in foster care, and this brought a confusing mix of relief and guilt. Relief at not having to care for her, guilt at not being there all the time. In supervised visits, she spoke little about her mother. When someone asked, she responded with short phrases like someone protecting something too fragile to be touched. There was no explicit anger, only a nameless emptiness. Sometimes she asked if her mother had called. Sometimes she said everything was fine when it wasn't. The mother, in turn, tried to reorganize her own narrative. She told acquaintances that she had been misinterpreted, that the system exaggerates, that raising children and caring for the elderly without help is impossible. At times, she seemed to believe it. At others, anger overflowed in long messages that no one answered. She didn't ask if her parents were okay. She asked when everything would go back to normal. She didn't realize that normal had never been safe. The process continued with evaluations, reports, formal meetings. Nothing quick, nothing cinematic. What existed was a collective weariness of similar stories. Professionals who had already seen grandparents left in back rooms, children transformed into invisible caregivers, families who confuse presence with care. Each completed form carried an uncomfortable repetition. This happens every day, in many places, with different faces. On one of the visits, the grandfather asked to speak alone with his granddaughter. They sat on a garden bench. He took a deep breath and said he wanted to ask for forgiveness for not realizing it sooner. He said that when his daughter returned home, he felt relieved not to be alone, and that this relief blinded him. He said that growing old is also about learning to ask for help too late. The girl listened in silence. She didn't have many words. She just rested her head on his arm and stayed there. It wasn't complete forgiveness. It was a beginning. The grandmother, another day, said something no one expected. She said she loved her daughter, but that loving didn't mean allowing everything. She said that if she could go back, she would have done things differently. She would have called someone sooner. The social worker noted it down, not as a confession, but as an understanding. Sometimes recognition is the only possible reparation. The grandmother seemed lighter after that, as if she had lifted a weight she didn't even know she was carrying. The girl began to talk more in therapy. She spoke of the nights she stayed awake, listening to footsteps that never came. She spoke of the fear of getting the dose of her medicine wrong, of the cold when the power went out, of the hunger that no longer hurt because it had become routine. She said she thought it was a matter of responsibility. When the therapist asked who had said that, she thought for a moment and replied, "Nobody. I just did it." That's when they understood the magnitude of the abandonment. It wasn't imposed with words, but with absence. Contact with the mother was gradually reduced, not out of revenge, but for protection. Each call destabilized the girl. The mother alternated between promises and accusations, saying she was changing, that everything would be different. She didn't present concrete plans, only requests. The team decided that the focus needed to be on the child and the elderly, not on comforting the person who caused the harm. This decision didn't come without guilt, but it came with responsibility. In the assisted living facility, the couple began to participate in simple activities. Grandpa joined a newspaper reading group. Grandma helped water the plants. Small tasks restored a sense of purpose that had been gradually taken away. They still talked about their daughter sometimes, but without the expectation that she would return to fix anything. It was a sad but necessary acceptance. The girl began to visit her grandparents with more ease. She no longer carried food hidden in her backpack. She no longer checked doors and windows. One afternoon, she asked if she could play in the garden while they talked to the social worker. It was the first time she had asked for something just for herself. When she returned, she was smiling, her hands dirty with soil. Her grandmother laughed and said that was a sign of good health. The girl didn't know it, but she felt it. Nothing was resolved perfectly. The mother remained distant, resentful. The couple carried silent regrets. The child had to rebuild the idea of care, but something that hadn't existed before emerged. A network, people watching, asking, accompanying. Abandonment lost its hiding place. Not because someone was punished exemplarily, but because someone ceased to be invisible. At a final meeting, the social worker said something simple. This didn't start when the ambulance arrived. She said it started when the absences became a habit, and no one intervened. She said that ending didn't mean forgetting, but preventing a recurrence. The grandfather nodded in agreement. The grandmother held her granddaughter's hand. The girl looked at them both and thought that for the first time she didn't have to decide anything alone. The world went on, indifferent as always. Other homes, other children, other elderly people continued living through similar situations. But in that story, something had been interrupted. The cycle didn't close with grand redemption, but with clear limits. And sometimes, that's the greatest justice life offers. As the months passed, the story ceased to be a matter for professionals and began to be lived in small, almost invisible details. The couple no longer counted the days as before. Grandma woke up early, sat by the window, and watched the garden change color. Grandpa learned the names of some of the residents and greeted everyone, even those who didn't respond. He said that speaking first was a way of existing. At night, they slept without the television on, something unthinkable before, when sound served to ward off fear. The girl began to understand that time could be reliable, that simple promises like, "I'll be back tomorrow," could be kept. At her new school, it took her a while to make friends. She didn't know how to play without keeping an eye on things. When someone shared their lunch, she was overly grateful. When someone was late, she became alarmed. Gradually, with constant help, she learned that care isn't something that is suddenly lost, that adults can make mistakes, but they shouldn't disappear. The mother tried, once again, to reconnect. She sent long messages, full of justifications. She said she was different, that she understood, that she needed her daughter. She didn't mention her parents. She didn't ask how they were. The team assessed the situation cautiously. They allowed a mediated conversation. The girl entered tense. The mother smiled, spoke quickly, promised changes. When asked what she would do differently, she talked about work, money, routine. She didn't talk about presence. The conversation ended early. There were no shouts, only a heavy silence that spoke louder than words. The couple learned of the attempt and reacted in different ways. The grandmother cried silently that night, not out of immediate longing, but out of grief for what never was. The grandfather became serious, then said he expected fewer promises and more actions. There was no more room for illusions. They learned too late that loving doesn't oblige one to accept abandonment. This understanding didn't bring joy, but it brought firmness. During a routine medical checkup, Grandpa received good news. The pneumonia had subsided and his weight had stabilized. The doctor commented that the body responds when life improves. He smiled slightly, as if not wanting to celebrate too loudly. Grandma had good days and confusing days, but she was no longer left alone with her lapses. There was someone to explain, repeat, and wait for. That made a difference. It didn't cure, but it cared. The girl, in a therapy session, said something surprising. She said she no longer felt hungry all the time, but was still afraid it would return. She said that sometimes she dreamed of stale bread and woke up sad. The therapist explained that bodily memories take longer to fade. That fear doesn't mean something will happen, only that it happened before. The girl listened attentively. She kept that information like one keeps a key. The legal process reached a conclusion without fanfare. The mother definitively lost custody, with the possibility of future visits conditioned on real changes. There was no applause, no sense of victory. There was a collective weariness and the awareness that this was necessary. The mother left saying that the world was unfair. No one responded. Sometimes silence is the only possible answer. The couple made an important decision. They asked that their granddaughter, whenever possible, be allowed to visit them more often, but without the obligation of caring for her. They wanted to see her play, not supervise her. They wanted to be grandparents, not her patients. When the girl heard this, she was confused and happy at the same time. She didn't know what it was like to be a granddaughter without responsibility. She learned little by little, making mistakes and asking questions. On an ordinary afternoon, the three of them sat in the garden. The grandmother told an old story, mixing facts and memories. The grandfather gently corrected her. The girl laughed. It was a simple scene, one that wouldn't attract anyone's attention. But there was something there that hadn't existed before. Balance. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the past. But it allowed one to breathe. The abandonment hadn't left visible marks on the world, but it had left deep scars on them. Even so, there was reconstruction. Not because someone offered nice apologies, but because someone interrupted the cycle. Because a child was no longer used as a shield. Because the elderly were no longer treated as a burden. This is not an exception. It is a possibility when someone decides to look. Their story didn't end with complete redemption. It ended with vigilance, with monitoring, with limits. It ended with the understanding that love, without responsibility, can turn into neglect, and that growing old in a family that doesn't care can be dangerous. What happened to them happens every day, in many homes, silently. The difference is when the silence is broken. On the last visit of the month, the girl brought a new drawing. It was of the assisted living facility, with a large garden and 3 figures holding hands. There were no closed doors, nor large shadows. The grandmother looked at it and said it seemed like a good place to be. The grandfather agreed. The girl put the drawing in her backpack and thought that perhaps for the first time the future didn't seem like a threatening place. The end didn't come as a final point, but as a continuous line that needed to be maintained. For the couple, what changed wasn't just where they slept, but the certainty that someone would be there the next day. The grandmother began to recognize the caregivers by name. The grandfather, always attentive, started correcting accounts, asking for explanations, participating, small gestures that said, "We are still here." They no longer spoke of their daughter as a hope, but as part of a story that had to be interrupted. This didn't erase the love, but it set limits where before there was only silence. The girl, now more confident, began to understand that care doesn't have to hurt, that it's not normal for a child to go hungry to keep adults alive. That responsibility isn't disguised abandonment. She still had difficult days, memories that surfaced without warning, but she no longer carried everything alone. She learned to ask for help before reaching her limit. Above all, she learned that being heard changes destinies. When someone believed in her, the world didn't fix itself, but it reorganized itself enough to breathe. The team that followed the case did not treat it as an exception. They knew that this happened repeatedly in other homes with other people, in different ways. They knew that abandonment rarely begins with explicit cruelty. It begins with delays, with promises, with justified absences. It begins when someone convinces themselves that the other can endure a little longer, and it ends when someone can't endure anything more. The difference, almost always, is the moment when someone decides to look. The mother moved on with her life, resentful, convinced she had been wronged. At times she seemed to understand. At others she blamed everyone around her. There was no easy reconciliation, no fabricated redemption. There was distance. And for that family, distance became protection. Not every bond needs to be maintained at all costs. Sometimes breaking is the only way to preserve what can still be saved. The couple continued to receive support. The grandfather's health improved. The grandmother had days of clarity and days of confusion, but she was never alone again. They began to receive regular visits, simple conversations, and hot meals. It wasn't a luxury. It was dignity. And dignity, when lacking, destroys more than any illness. They learned late in life that accepting help is not weakness. It's survival. The girl gradually became a child again. She played without being watched, slept without internal alarms, ate without worrying about tomorrow. She still bore marks, but they were no longer open wounds. They were memories that taught her to be careful. In a final conversation with the social worker, she said something simple. Now, when someone leaves, I know they'll come back. That small phrase said it all. This story isn't about monsters, nor about heroism. It's about everyday negligence, about repeated choices, about how abandonment can hide behind the word family. It's about elderly people being forgotten while they're still breathing. It's about children growing up too fast because no one takes responsibility for what should be done. And it's about the price of that, which is almost always paid in silence. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched on something real. Maybe you know someone going through something similar. Maybe you are that someone. Elder abuse isn't just leaving someone alone. It's denying them food, care, attention, information. It's isolating, lying, using, exploiting. And this happens every day, all over the world, without cameras, without headlines. If you know of an elderly person suffering from mistreatment, isolation, financial abuse, or neglect, don't ignore it. Seeking help is not betraying the family, it's protecting lives. In the United States, support is available. The Elder Care Locator can be reached at 1-800-677-1116. For cases of fraud and financial abuse against the elderly, the National Elder Fraud Hotline is available at 1-833-372-8317. In situations of immediate danger, call 911. These calls can save lives, as they have here. And if you are elderly and going through something like this, know this: you are not a burden. You are not exaggerating. You don't have to endure it in silence. Asking for help is a right. Growing old shouldn't mean disappearing. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. Comments help these stories reach those who need to hear them. Sometimes all that's missing is someone recognizing what's happening and saying, enough is enough. Silence protects abuse. Attention protects people. The story ends here, but the responsibility continues. Look, listen, act, because no one should grow old, hungry, afraid, or abandoned, and no child should bear the burden of silently supporting adults. Analysis completed. Coherent conclusion, consistent emotional impact, integrated social alert, natural CTA, and retention maintained until the end. Story concluded.